Hi, I'm Chris with the Flood Insurance Guru. I'm here with our content manager, Jacob, today. Now look, as you go through this process of trying to figure out flood insurance, it can feel complicated. It can feel overwhelming. I know I was in those shoes more than a decade ago when I bought a house in a flood zone. Almost lost that house because my premiums were $3,000 a year. So real quick today, I'm going to talk about things that you need to look for on a flood policy as you're reviewing this and you're trying to make a decision. What fine print do you need to look at?
Okay, Chris, so we're going to break it down into different sections. We're going to go over coverage basics, claims process, the financial aspect, the rate and renewal issues, private insurance specifics, whether it's business and commercial, compliance on lender issues, and the last one would be coordination with other insurance. Okay, so let's talk about this. Okay, so starting off on coverage basics, one question we have here is, how exactly does this policy define flood and what water damage is that covered?
So that's a good question. So there's a big thing to understand between water damage and flood damage. But first, let's talk about what defines a flood. Typically, the National Flood Insurance Program is talking about 2 properties or more. That could be something as simple as a city street and a building, or 2 acres. They're dry, they're normally inundated with water. Remember, the water actually has to enter your property. This can't be groundwater. It's got to be surface water. So that's how they define it. Now, water damage, when somebody thinks about a pipe bursting, a toilet backing up, sewer septic system backing up, these are all water damage situations. While a flood damage is going to be that surface water, like a river, a lake, rainfall, flash flood that comes rushing in. That's the difference between flood damage and water damage. Water damage is going to be something that, if set up correctly, is going to be covered by a home insurance policy many times. But flood damage is only going to be covered by flood insurance. That's why you do need to have a really good home insurance policy and a really good flood insurance policy.
Okay, our next question here says, if flooding were to cause foundation to shift or crack, is that person still covered?
That's a little different one. Earth movement is what some people may call it. But if it was initially caused by flood damage, so say the flood water comes rushing in, pushes that foundation, that's going to be considered flood damage. Now, we see this a lot when people don't have things like flood vents because you have hydraulic pressure. This is pressure that builds up from the water when it comes into a foundation. It causes the foundation to crumble because of that pressure. But when you have something like flood vents, the water can come in and exit, and you don't build that pressure. So yes, something like this generally could be covered if it's truly caused by a flood.
Okay, so our next question here says, what's covered on my detached garage or shed?
So typically on a detached garage or shed, if you look at the National Flood Insurance Program, it has some areas here where it's used for parking, storage, or access. Those kinds of things are going to be different coverages. Typically when it comes to just say building coverage, if it's a detached garage, which means not attached to the building at all, you immediately have up to 10% of the actual building coverage there. So let's just say you have $250,000 policy. It means you may only have $25,000 for that garage just listed on there. Now with the National Flood Insurance Program, this may actually need to be a separate policy if it's truly detached because of the way they look at buildings and they should have a shared roof, walkway. There's many different scenarios here. So when you're working with your flood insurance agent, you want to make sure to ask those questions correctly because it could be that this is not covered if you don't have separate policies here. Now with a private flood insurance policy, you'll be able to put this on those other structures, typically giving yourself up to 10% of whatever the building coverage is. Same thing with the inventory on the inside. You want to think about that when you think about belongings.
Okay. So our last question here under coverage basics is, does flood insurance cover a basement and what you have stored in it?
That's a good question. We get that a lot on basements. Remember, we're talking about basements, we're talking about all 4 sides or below grade. This could be below grade by 6 inches, but it's still below grade. So it could be stuff like a sunken room or something. When it comes to stuff down there, let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first. Typically, coverage is very limited. Today, things like your foundation walls, things that make the building safe, like your water heater, maybe an air conditioner down there, staircase, circuit breaker, those kinds of things. It's not going to cover things like drywall, carpet. Now, some private flood insurance policies will cover up to $10,000 or $20,000 in contents coverage, but also some private flood insurance companies may define a basement differently. They may actually design, for example, some call it a walkout basement with the National Flood Insurance Program calls this an elevator with enclosure. So that's what's also important to work with an insurance agent who truly understands these different foundation types, how private flood insurance companies look at it, how the National Flood Insurance Program look at it, and how both of these can have a financial impact on you as the property owner.
Okay, can we back up just for a second, just for those who may not know, you said below grade, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, below ground, so think about this. Below ground, it's that simple. You're below grade.
Okay. So let's move over to the claims process now. Our first question says, what paperwork do I need to file within 60 days? And what happens if I miss that deadline?
So you get the letter of proof of loss is usually what it's called. With the National Flood Insurance Program, you basically get your claim. It's a pretty simple process. You call in, they'll give you something to sign normally to submit. But what happens if you said this thing at 61 days? Sadly, your claim could be denied. In fact, we saw this happen with someone who waited until the 61st day. That's important to work with your insurance agent. Do I want to file a claim? Well, it's catastrophic. So private, you file a claim, you may never be able to get private flood insurance again in some situations. With the National Flood Insurance Program, what if this is your second, third? In fact, we had a customer who had 4 flood claims in a 2-year period, putting him on a severe repetitive loss list. You want to have a conversation with your insurance agent to understand, hey, what's going to be the financial impacts long-term on this property? What's going to be the financial impacts long-term on me? Is this $2,000 claim really going to cost me $30,000?
Okay. So our next question here says, do I need an engineer's report to prove flood damage, and who pays for it?
No, you don't need an engineer's report. No, sometimes you do have to bring an engineer in for something, but they bring an adjuster, a field adjuster in. That field adjuster comes out, does a report on the damage. But you as the property owner want to document things with video and photos, put them into something like a Google Drive, some kind of storage that you can submit to the adjuster even before the adjuster gets out there, speeding up your claims process.
Okay. So our last question here in claims process is, how quickly do I need to report a claim after it floods?
Yeah, the quicker the better. In one reason too, to get that water out there so you don't cause mold, because many times mold damage is not covered by flood insurance. So definitely the quicker the better. You're getting a mediation company out there to get that water removed. It's going to be quicker the better.
Okay, so let's take a minute to move over to the financial aspect of this. Our first question there says, will I get enough money to actually rebuild, or just what my old stuff was worth?
You may not get enough money for what your old stuff was worth. It depends on how your policy was written, especially a private company. You want to make sure that you're insuring at least 80% of the replacement cost. This means the true cost to replace the building. If not, it could default to an actual cash value where you may only get 40 or 50%. And I'll give you an example. We had a lady in Texas that kept coming to us getting quotes. She had existing policies with someone else, $150,000 policy, but they only kept paying out like $15,000 claims. It didn't make sense. It's because this was an actual cash value policy. So imagine what an actual cash value policy is. Depreciation is taken out. So let's just say this computer right here is really 2 years old, but if I had replacement costs, I could get what it costs to replace today. But if I didn't, I would get what it cost when you bought it 2 years ago. Well, guess what? That could be a huge difference, and especially something like this with equipment. So that's kind of the difference there between replacement costs, actual cash value, and what you can expect when it comes to a claim.
Okay. Are there dollar limits on replacing expensive finishes or custom work?
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to flood insurance, you want to make sure you have that listed on there. Things like artwork, jewelry are going to be covered differently. They're going to have designated amounts. When it comes to replacement costs, it depends on what's in your policy chapter. This is your actual flood insurance policy. You want to read it, and you want to read the section on loss settlement, loss assessment. This is going to tell you how your loss is going to be assessed. Is it going to be assessed on the replacement cost for the building, actual cash value? How are these other things going to be covered? So go to that loss assessment, loss settlement section, and look for that before signing up for that flood insurance policy.
Okay. So our last question here just says, how long do I have to wait for my coverage kicks in?
Well, the wait period really depends. So let's just say you have a loan closing. Typically, there's not a wait period at all. If you're just doing the standard policy with the National Flood Insurance Program, 30-day wait period. But if your floods are just changed, you may be able to get under that newly mapped area, which is a 1-day wait. With most private flood insurance type, it's an average of 3 to 5 business days.
Okay, so now we're going to move over into rate and renewal issues. Our first question under there says, what factors determine my premium and which ones might change?
So fees that determine your premiums, especially private or in the National Flood Insurance Program, we're talking about like distance to water, elevation of your building, replacement costs.